Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your First Amendment rights to protest, right? So it's very clear in the First Amendment, right? The very first right that's protected by the framers of the Constitution, that you have the ability to redress grievances against a wrongful government, right? You can get up and say, hey, government, you suck. These are the reasons why I think you suck, and you should be protected from any kind of negative consequences of doing that, as long as you remain peaceful, right? Because you have the right to peaceably assemble. Now, what's been going on over the last few days in cities all across America, including Los Angeles, is that people have been doing these kind of peaceful protests throughout the day. However, when it gets to the evenings, there's definitely been flashpoints that have sparked off, and a lot of people have engaged in some violent and criminal behavior, right? But here's what I'm going to say with regards to that. I think one of the things that always gets lost when we have these discussions is there's a lot of justified anger in these communities, and it has a lot more to do with than just what's going on with the George Floyd case, right? Because a lot of people are mad about the killing of George Floyd, but that alone usually isn't enough to trigger a response in people. What's really driving people is the fact that the system has been broken for a lot longer than that, right? So I'm going to look at three cases, right? We're going to talk about George Floyd, but before that, I want to go all the way back in time, and I want to talk about the Watts riots, right? Because there's been a long history of rebellion here in the city of Los Angeles. So I'm going to go all the way back to 1965, right? When Marquette Frye was driving his car under the influence, he got pulled over by the police, right? What ends up happening is his family comes out and a scuffle ensues, and Frye and his mother and family end up getting arrested. Now, the police were particularly brutal, but this sparked a unrest within the population. But it wasn't just Frye, because when we look at what was going on in LA at the time and had been building up for the decades prior to, is we have to look at the racist systems at play, right? In LA, there were racial covenants and redlining. Both of these things were limiting access for African Americans to move into neighborhoods that would allow them to have access to better jobs and to better resources, right? And so African Americans were kind of forced into certain neighborhoods and were unable to obtain certain jobs, keeping them poor, right? This also gave the police an opportunity to target them as a population, right? African Americans were relegated to these tight little neighborhoods, and police officers would go into those neighborhoods and abuse them in ways that they wouldn't do in white neighborhoods. This was also going on a lot in Latino neighborhoods. If you really want to check it out, look at the Bloody Christmas of 1951, right? But when we're starting to take a look at the anger that was going on in this population, it had to do with police, but it had to do with the fact that the whole system was working against them to keep them poor, to keep them fighting each other, to keep them from being able to move beyond this. And so when we look at what happened to Marquette Frye, it had less to do with that one incident. That incident was a flashpoint. It was the match that lit the already existing barrels of powder ready to explode. Right now, the Watts rebellion was serious, right, and it lasted for several days. But it got to the point where people were breaking up chunks of sidewalk and destroying police vehicles, burning buildings down. Firefighters were prevented from coming in. At the end of it, 36 people lost their lives, with thousands of being injured. And it was estimated that $40 million worth of damage was done, right, during the course of this time, right? In response to the Watts riot, right? There's been, again, kind of two ways of looking at it, right? When we look at policing in the city, there's definitely was a crackdown on what African Americans were allowed to do moving forward. But then you also have to think about, in a way, the Watts riots also led to a lot of pride and solidarity within the community, okay? Jump ahead, 1992. Actually, sorry, I'm skipping a year ahead. 1991. Rodney King, African American male, again pulled over for reckless driving and speeding, and took the police on a chase. But he was pulled out of the car, and after being arrested, he was beaten by several police officers, right, in the spring of 1991. In 1992, the officers who had been charged with wrongdoing were all acquitted, right? And all of them got off in the spring of 1992 with no charges against them. And that's when the city erupted again, right? Now, the LA riots of 1992 spanned over multiple portions of the city, right? At the end of the 5 days of rioting, there were 63 deaths, and it's estimated that $1 billion worth of damage was done, and over 1,000 buildings were burned to the ground during that period of time, right? One of the things that you saw during the LA riots was a real concerted effort to make sure that African American businesses were not targeted by the rioters, right? People would put up signs within their businesses. But again, this speaks to an underlying tension that was already going on, right? Previously, in the years leading up to it, an African American girl had been shot by a Korean store clerk, right? And then the woman was who should have received charges was just let off with probation. This had created tension between the two communities, and so Koreatown really suffered as a result of this during the 1992 riots, right? Again, the underlying factors, the anger that was already existing, is what drove a lot of the action, okay? So let's jump ahead to today when we're looking at what's going on with George Floyd, right? Now, I cannot say, because we're still in the midst of it right now, as I'm making this video, there are people in my city who are out and they're protesting, and some of them are ready to get rowdy, right? And so I cannot say all of the underlying factors because we haven't had time to breathe on it and see it, but I will say this, right? What happened to George Floyd was undeniably wrong, right? I think some of the underlying factors has been the following, right? So I'm going to try to touch on a couple of things, right? First is we're living in a new era where everyone gets to see these things in a lot more detail than we used to, right? The Rodney King riot was such a huge deal because there was videotape of it, and that was one of the first times that people in mass could really see what went on. So even if you were not directly there, even if it wasn't from your community, you saw an African American man being mistreated by the police, which triggered in you a response, right? Well, now we have lots of these videos, right? And we have even more, right? Because of two different factors. First, everybody's got a cell phone, right? Everybody can film what's going on around them. That's what happened with George Floyd, right? We have multiple videos from bystanders. Because everybody has cell phones, now everybody is able to see things from new perspectives that we weren't able to see before. But secondly is, after the Michael Brown incident, where Michael Brown was killed for supposedly stealing a box of cigars, right? The federal government and local state and city governments have really put a push into having body cameras on police officers, right? These have allowed for civilians to request video of policing actions, right? Which has also increased our visibility of these things. I think the video cam from Stephon Clark was really integral in exposing the things that went on in his particular instance, right? And so exposure is one big thing. We're more exposed to these things. Another issue that's kind of at play is COVID-19. I'm not gonna lie, the fact that everybody has been cooped up indoors for the last couple of months has really put everybody on edge, right? Because if you're looking at the videos, everyone that I've been seeing in Minnesota, for example, there are a lot of people that don't really look like they're that oppressed, right? And I really think that this is an opportunity for a lot of people to voice their frustrations with systems that maybe are not directly tied to this issue, right? And so then the last piece that I think is driving all this is all of the racist systems that were put in place that were the trigger for the Watts Rebellion, that were the trigger for the LA riots in the 90s, are still in place, right? In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, where this happened, right? The same racial covenants that only allowed African Americans to move into certain neighborhoods were true in Minneapolis. The neighborhood where George Floyd was murdered is one of those neighborhoods that was just limited to African Americans, and that was designed to be an impoverished neighborhood. Over the decades, people have fought in those communities to make them more vibrant and to bring in some wealth. But if you even look at the housing prices, right? The housing prices in all of Minneapolis have been going up, except in that neighborhood. Why is that? It's because people in power are keeping those prices low because it benefits them, right? And so one of the things that I really just want you to think about at the end of all of this is, when you're using your First Amendment right, how are you executing it, right? Because there's limitations to it, right? You are permitted to go out and peacefully protest, but the minute that peaceful protest crosses into violence, you technically are no longer protected by it. And that doesn't necessarily just limit to your actions, right? If you are out after curfew, which has been legally set, and someone does something violent and criminal and you're in their presence, you potentially could be charged with that. It'd be harder to stick, and I think that's why a lot of people are out there now, because it's like, nobody can see me, I'm in my COVID mask. But the reality is, you could potentially be charged for other people's actions, right? Doesn't mean that it would stick, but just be conscious of that, right? When we're thinking about the First Amendment, again, this is one of the sticking points between the political left and the political right, right? The political left really feel that voicing your anger in these moments is justified. On the political right, there's a lot of questions about that. So just think about what that might mean for, I don't know, November 2020. Is anything coming up in November 2020? Oh, an election year, right? So when we're thinking about voting for people, right, Donald Trump has a very particular agenda with respect to the protests that are going on. He's going out of his way to make sure that his supporters view them as unlawful, as wrong, and tying all that back into race, right? Aren't you afraid of these people coming up? Who can save you? Trump can. Okay? So just be conscious of how your actions not only are a representation of your voice, but they also potentially can represent the community that you are part of. Okay? So again, there's something to work on, and then that's it for this week. Okay? I just want you to kind of lock it down.